Welcome to all of you, whether you've travelled from afar or indeed this is your home. And Rashmi, when we talk about home, what does that mean to you?
Thank you so much, Georgina. When you ask me about home, home for me is the place with a courtyard.
Can I just get you to bring your mic a little bit closer to your mouth? Can't.
Am I right now?
Yeah,
okay.
That's better.
Yes, okay. Home for me is a place where there's a courtyard, there's a bonfire, grandparents telling stories. But this is the place where I come from. I am from Assam. My community is the Bodo community, the largest indigenous community of Assam, because Assam has a number of communities and sub-communities, and my ancestors have originally come from, because you're asking me about what home means to me, I'll just tell you. They had come from the region between the headwaters of the Yangtze-Kiang and the Wangho rivers in the northwest of China to arrive in this country between the 2nd millennium BC and the 1st millennium AD. So we belong to the Mongoloid stock, to the Indo-Tibetan, the Tibetan-Bourbon branch. So this is what my home is originally. And now we are the settlers in Assam. We are Bodos of Assam. And for the Bodos, our history, the history of our homeland, the history of our heritage starts undocumented through storytelling. And this is where my stories take birth.
And Marcia, for you, country is obviously an incredibly important word. What does that mean, though?
Thanks, Georgina. It's a huge honour to be here at the Jaipur Literature Festival. So, country is like a Creole word, you know, so it's adopted from English, to represent a big concept in the Aboriginal world. And so it can mean home, you know, so you can ask somebody, where's your country? But it has a bigger meaning, and that is the inherited lands and waters of the group of people that you belong to. And that group could be a clan in some parts of Australia, or a big extended family speaking a language, one language, or maybe more than one language, but identifying with one main language like the Pitjantjatjara. So they're out in the central desert. They have vast countries, right? And then if you're on the coast, where there are rich resources, lots of lineages, lots of languages, lots of clans, and so the country is perceived as arising in the sacred past from the ancestors. The present day people inherit it, and along with the land and waters and even the sky, they inherit a set of obligations and responsibilities to the country. So it's a big concept about, who you are in the world, who made you, who your family is, and the type of ecosystem that you come from. So along with country, you get what is called in anthropology a totem. We don't call them totems, and they're not totems. As a result of Bruce Chatwin's travelogue about Australia called Songlines, people seem to think that, we use the word dreaming or songlines, and people do to make it easy for English speakers. But the ancestral beings that are, often represented as non-human, say the eagle or the crow or, a snake, or often as humans too, the two women, the two men. These are the, creators of the world that we know they created the land, they created the language, the people, but in a highly spiritual way. And so, you know, one goes to the place where those ancestors are said to have created people and created a language. And these are, you know, very sacred places in the Aboriginal world. So it's a big concept, and it can mean home, but it means so much more than that as well.
As you say, a huge concept. So you take that huge concept, but you start it very small. You write about little villages. Tell us more about your beginnings, where they are really centered in tiny communities.
Sorry, in tiny communities?
Talking about village life.
And talking about village life, yes, exactly. This is where the very birth of our traditions come from. The storytelling. The storytelling is very much inherent into the village community life, the village life. We are normally rural folks. We come from a rural background, and ours is a community where we have our households are patterned in such a way. We have a central courtyard, and the home state is such that we have the hutments all around the courtyard. And in the northeastern corner of the courtyard, we have a plant. It is a cacti. The Boros call it the sijo. That stands in for our deity. So we call our deity Bato. And Bato, where for the Boros, Ba is 5. And for the Boros, we believe that the 5 elements of the sky, the earth, air, water, and fire, these are the 5 elements that make up everything in the universe. And this, the strength of these 5 elements, Ba, and To means profound, very deep. It is the profound depth of these 5 elements that make up the entire system, the entire philosophy of our village communities. And the village community thrives on storytelling, not just as lullabies for babies, but as chronicling of who we are, where we came from, what were our stories, who were our conquerors, and who were our warriors. It is all inherent in that village community, where grandparents tell stories to the grandchildren, and then it is handed down. Ours is not a community where history is documented. We didn't have written documents for a long time. It is only in recent years that these documents have started. However, there has been in the village communities, I'll give you a very small instance where even now when we have weddings in the villages, like in the towns we have everything outsourced. We have caterers, we have decorators, we have a lot of people doing our work we have dress designers and all. But back in the villages, it is not like that. In the neighborhood, in the communities, one set of people will just come to chop the vegetables, one set of people will do the marketing, and another set of people will be doing the arrangement. So this is the community life in our villages. Things are changing. The old ways are giving in to new ways, but yes, the old ways are still there in some sense.
And are they changing in your community too, Marcia? Are we seeing the community ways changing within your community?
There's been profound change since 1788 when the British arrived. And, you know, it's important to say to an audience like this that it's impossible to understand the present-day Aboriginal world without understanding the extraordinary history of the British invasion and a very deliberate attempt, if not by the Crown in all instances, in many instances by the settler colonialists who came to Australia, to eradicate the Aboriginal world. And so the Australian Wars, as we call them, which raged from soon after settlement, with the British attempting to move out of Port Jackson, which is now Sydney, Circular Quay, to the hinterland over the Blue Mountains. Even before they went up over the mountains, there were massacres, and declaration of martial law once they got over the Blue Mountains by Governor Brisbane. And so the Australian wars spread north and south, and then eventually across the country. And the violence did not really end until, probably I would say the 1920s or 1930s. And we are still documenting those wars and the death toll. So following the wars, the people were incarcerated in administrative settlements. In most cases, children were removed from their families in the tens of thousands. And so what people call today our modern day communities were in fact established by the new states after Federation and by missionaries, some in the 19th century, but most in the 20th century. So these communities are not traditional homes in most cases. They're more the remnants of a system of total administration, if you like, of total control. Change came from about the 1970s, legislative reform, the idea of human rights and the human rights of Aboriginal people, and there's been a slow accretion of human rights, and communities are now regarded in many instances as Australian townships, but that's been a very slow process. So a very Australian system of apartheid operated from the end of the wars to about the 1970s, and that's been slowly reformed by laws based on human rights. We're nowhere near equality yet, but the life in the communities is very vibrant in most cases. It'd be great to have more housing and better health. The statistics are appalling. But from these very same communities came the art movements and the literature and the ideas and a revival of Aboriginal cultures that I have to say, having lived through much of it, I look back on it and I think it's quite extraordinary how much of our culture we've been able to revive, preserve, and innovate. So much of our culture is misrepresented by those who came with the British and documented us, largely as, pathetic savages. What a good idea to replace savage life with British life. And that's what our Dumbak Gubgawana volumes are about at the University of Melbourne. So the very explicit goal of the very first Vice-Chancellor of the university was to replace anything Indigenous with a British system of knowledge. And that's very explicitly stated. In fact, the cover of our first volume shows some, anthropologists, and standing behind them are the Aboriginal men whose knowledge they stole and converted into a kind of British idea of the inferior races. But as we begin to document ourselves, our own cultures, we are able to correct the record. So, Bruce Chatwin's idea of songlines, it's not correct. There are many different forms of music, and song series are just one form of our music. The idea of the dreaming is, it comes from one of those early anthropologists, Baldwin Spencer or, Strello. They all use this term. It's a very poor representation of a religious system. And so we ourselves have to write our cultures into the record. And that's the point of Indigenous knowledge studies. Indigenous people representing their own systems of knowledge against the colonial record.
So when we then think about state control within your own area of the world, what happens when borders move but people don't? What does that do to your sense of identity?
For us, the border moving thing has not yet been there for the boroughs. I'm basically talking about the borough because they are wanting certain things. The border is not into the scene as yet. But when the ancestors came over, it was not a political thing about the border shifting. They had come on their own way. They had come and they were new settlers in a new land. And it is here that in this new land, after the shifting of the borders, that they had, because you talked about music, musical instruments and all. So here, it was here that they started leaving their their origins behind. They have started to build on their own music, their own instruments, their own lifestyle, their own farmings, their own weaving, their own clothing, their own cooking style, their own cattle rearing. So I would like to tell you about this book. So this book, Whistles of the Siphoong. Siphoong for the boroughs is the flute. And it is the most basic of the instruments that we use. It is the wand of the divine. And the borough flute is slightly different from the normal flute because we have, like I told you earlier, we have 5 as a very profound, very deep meaning in our philosophy. So even the borough flute has just 5 holes in it. And we say that we need air to breathe, we need air to live. And it is air that we put into the flute to bring it to life so that we can play it. And shifting the borders has brought this thing into existence. Perhaps if my ancestors would have stayed back in the headwaters of the Wang Ho and the Yangtze Kiang, perhaps these changes would not have come about. Perhaps they would have lived in their life what they lived out there. But it is because of the cross-border thing that have come over that this new way of life came to be, because they settled mostly along the river, the Brahmaputra which flows through the whole of Assam, and the boroughs call it the Bulung Butur. It's the same river, but it's called by different names all over. So this is what perhaps the cross-border thing brings about in a people, in a community. And the cross-border effect also brings in people this urge to keep their indigeneity alive in them, and which is why they are so intense in creating their own music, their own dance form, their own dress. This is the dress I am wearing. It is the Bodo costume. It is called the Dokuna. It is not the Ohomia Mekhela Sador, but this is what I wanted to tell you. This is why I stood out, which I think I should not have, but okay, it's good because I wanted people to see. So the cross-border thing is all about what brings change in a community, what brings change in people to bring their own new identity, a fresh new identity, and which they would love to passionately guard.
Thank you. Marcia, when we talk about displacement within the Aboriginal communities, it's not always physical, though, is it? It can happen in other ways. How does it show itself in a non-physical way?
Well, I'm reminded by what Rashmi has said of a really interesting aspect of Indigenous knowledge systems in Australia. So Australia has, essentially one official language, English. It's the language of instruction in all schools, and it's been very difficult to get Aboriginal languages taught in schools. I think we've managed to have 2 or 3 or maybe 4 taught in schools of the many hundreds of languages. But just take the concept of seasons, the British idea of seasons imported to Australia, autumn, summer, spring, winter, and they are the official seasons. And, they're marked on the calendar. There are ancient Aboriginal seasonal calendars which make a lot more sense for our environment and our climate. And slowly we're documenting all of them. And usually there are 3 big seasons, and within each season there are sub-seasons. So a group in North Australia might have 9 or 10 seasons. In the north, non-Indigenous people refer to 2 seasons, the wet and the dry. But in fact, there are 9 or 10 seasons, but they don't see those subtleties. And as you travel across the north from east to west, these seasonal changes alter slightly. So the little season before the wet, which is very, very hot and humid and there's very little rain, that season might be in October in Cape York, but it will be in December in the Kimberley, in the west. And these seasons are called by scientists, the ecological seasons, as opposed to the calendrical seasons of the British. And slowly each group is reviving their own seasonal calendar and trying to get non-Indigenous people to understand the ecologies where they live and the climates where they live. And this is very relevant in Australia because of our terrible bushfires. You might have seen the news, I don't know if it's reported here, that in Victoria and New South Wales, just in the last few weeks, we've had catastrophic bushfires again. We have them, increasingly now. Once upon a time, you might expect catastrophic bushfires once every 50 years or once every 10 years. Now, it's almost every 5 years that we get catastrophic bushfires. And people don't understand the seasons and they don't understand how to manage fire in the Australian landscapes. Whereas Aboriginal people have lived for tens of thousands of years with the fire regimes of Australia and managed fire. And there's a wonderful book about it, actually, called The Greatest Estate on Earth by Bill Gammage. And he says, rightly, that Australia had a continent-wide land management system developed by Aboriginal peoples over thousands of years. And it worked. It doesn't mean to say that, you're going to stay in one place in the face of a raging Australian bushfire. Of course you're going to move. But where people live and hunt and travel, landscapes were created that were amenable to human life and also to non-human life. So particular species were encouraged by our fire management systems by creating a mosaic of small, cool fires across the landscape without threatening to create a catastrophic bushfire, by having small fires in cool seasons when the dew is heavy and the land is damp, you can keep the feral bush down and create grasslands and sparse forests through which people could travel. And this was observed by the first settlers, and some of them talked about the world that they saw that Aboriginal people had created as a pastoral idyll, and they thought, great, we'll move our cattle and our sheep in here, this is perfect. But they didn't look after the land. Once they'd taken the land from Aboriginal people, they did not know how to manage the land. And now you have, environmentalists who believe that these dense forests are natural and the right kind of environment to have in Australia. No, in the Aboriginal world, they're extremely dangerous. And without the management of Aboriginal people, because Aboriginal people were removed, the forests have become tinder boxes and the fires have become atomic fires. And so we have a movement called the cultural burning movement to try to get the non-Indigenous people to understand how to manage the land. So that's just one instance of, the value, the present-day value of Aboriginal knowledge, of our landscapes, of the weather, of the dew, of the winds, and so much more, and obviously vegetation communities. But it's been very difficult to get scientists, environmental scientists, botanists, to understand this. There are a few who do, especially in the north, less so in the south. But landowners now, non-Indigenous landowners, are coming to the cultural burning movement and saying, can you help me manage my land because, what we're doing is not working. So that's an interesting aspect of Indigenous knowledge.
Absolutely. Rashmi, when we look at culture, I wonder if losing your culture is the price you pay for progress. When you look at your own Indigenous culture, do you feel that to progress, for your communities to thrive, you are losing some of that culture?
Yes, of course, yes. I think we are losing some of the culture because the whole family system, the whole village system is moving. The culture effect is not in an airtight compartment. We cannot talk about culture without talking about the community life, without talking about the village system, without talking about our old ways. So one shift tends to shift the whole chain of things that make up the village, the community life. So in our culture, we do have this thing about community harvesting, community feasting, community. We do everything in a community, we do everything as one. But when it's coming down to the nuclear family, now the village system is also coming down to slowly, children are coming out of the villages to pursue different, their own studies, their career, their ambitions. In the process, the large joint families of the olden days is being broken down. It is coming down to smaller families. And with it, the festivals, the rituals are also observed, celebrated in smaller ways. It is no more celebrated in the grandeur that it used to be in earlier days, which is how, in the process, the cultural deviation is also taking place. Because children are now learning about these cultures only from research scholars. They're learning about it from textbooks. But in the olden times, they used to be handed down practically. When it was ritual time, we are originally worshippers of nature, so we believed that God has no form. We used to say it is Obang Lauri. But slowly, with the influence of external elements, and this influence of the external elements has brought about a change in culture, and with it, there has been a change in influence of beliefs. So we started believing in a God with a form, and then it has started to merge with Hindu gods and other forms of belief, other forms of deity. So slowly, the original forms have given way to evolvement, have given way to some kind of influence from other beliefs. Yet, there is still a strong rootedness to the original. We try to preserve that, we try to promote that, but yes, we do agree that there is a shift from the original culture, and the community spirit in us is so strong. But gradually, I think that thing is evolving. Like I told you about the weddings that took place, and even in the festivals, we have Sankranti, we have Bihu, which is a harvesting festival. We have just had it during January, mid-January. So it used to be a very huge feasting time. There would be community fishing. The villagers, all the villagers, the men, women would get together in the village ponds, and they would be fishing together, and whatever they would collect, they would all cook it together. It's a picnic style. It's a massive village picnic style, and they would all feast by a bonfire in the evening. They would sing songs, they would dance. However, this thing still exists in smaller pockets all over Assam, perhaps all over the country, and perhaps elsewhere. But where I am talking about my homeland, this thing still exists in smaller pockets. But because of the lack of people in the villages, and because of the modernity that is slowly creeping in, this celebration, this observation of the zest, the zeal, the enthusiasm of community fishing, it's actually fun, you know, not just listening to it, but you should see the community fishing spirit. You're in a pond, your garment is lifted knee-high, and you're wading in a pond. You have sometimes leech sticking to your legs. You have all kinds of crabs sticking to your toes. And you bring out your toes, you think it's a small fish, but you try to take it out. It's actually a crab sticking onto your fingers. It's actually fun. And it's cold, but the villagers are sweating because they are in such a festive high. They're singing songs, they're splattering mud onto each other. And of course, this calls in for a little bit of chivalry and flirtatiousness. So this is a very happy mood because the harvesting is just done. The granaries are full. The breaking down of the village community system, the breaking down of the breaking down of the joint family is bringing this community celebration smaller and smaller and smaller. It is on the verge of perhaps fading. This is sad, but we're in small pockets, it is still there, so there is some hope to it living.
Thank you. Well, with that image of happy leeches still
Yes.
resonating,
Yes.
we're going to turn to the audience and see if there are any questions from out there. I'm just going to put my glasses on. I think we've got a couple of volunteers with microphones who will come to you if you have a question, and we have one just there. Thank you. Yep, go ahead.
My question is, as an Australian, given the traditional governance systems of people responsible for their communities in smaller regions, how can Australia provide a voice that incorporates many different groups that can then be a strong force for our government?
A very good and timely question, thank you. So just a few weeks ago in the state of Victoria, which is the southeastern state, just north of Tasmania, the Victorian Parliament passed legislation called the Statewide Treaty Act, which establishes the first treaty in Australia. Until then, Australia, we believe, was the only British settler colony that had not negotiated a treaty with its Indigenous people. And that was largely because of the legal fiction of terra nullius, a land without people, a land that could not be governed. And so it has taken over 200 years to negotiate a treaty, the first treaty in Australia, and it's a very complex bill, act with somewhere between 300 and 500 pages. It establishes a treaty assembly and two other branches of Indigenous governance. It creates elected bodies across Victoria so that local peoples can elect their own representative. It establishes a formal procedure for the Assembly to give advice to the Victorian government on matters pertaining to Victorian Aboriginal people. And it is a very powerful step forward after the loss of the referendum in 2023, when more than 60% of Australians voted against recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution through the mechanism of a voice for our peoples to the Commonwealth Government. There is another formal body in South Australia, and it's again legislated by the state legislature, and it's called the South Australian Voice. And again, it creates a body to advise the government. It's an elected body. And so forms of Aboriginal customary governance, for example, cultural regions, elders, languages, cultural groupings, have been incorporated into the idea of, voting as democracy. Of course, it doesn't always work for small groups of people up against a huge majority. But by having these mechanisms, it's very clear that our democracy is vastly improved in that the interests of Aboriginal people are finally represented and not left outside of the responsibilities of government.
We're just going to take a very quick question. There was one on this side there. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for addressing the problem. We as Indians are facing a lot. As ma'am has said that we need to progress also and we need to conserve our culture also. What we can do to avoid this conflict, ma'am, somewhere on the road of progress, we are on a guilt trip as well, especially the Gen Z and millennials. Please help it out, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
That's for you, Rashmi, and please be aware of the time.
Yes. So you actually want to know about conflict of, sorry?
Ma'am, as you have addressed the conflict that we need to progress also, and we need to conserve our culture also.
There's a conflict there.
We suffer a dilemma, as kind of dilemma. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I think this is a very difficult thing to handle. This is a very difficult thing to maneuver now. And we can just make the optimum use of, like, saving water, cutting down trees and all. If it is not necessary, we can just leave it like that. Perhaps, we need the roads to enter into the villages, but we need not cut down the trees. Maybe we can find out an optional route to take the road, We can take land from fields, and again, that would be bringing down the agricultural land into the minus. So perhaps we can bring out a fine balance, and perhaps we can use technology to, again, do other things to preserve nature, which we were handicapped in earlier times. So this conflict perhaps will always remain. Yes.
And just to sum up, really, from both of you, I'd love you to tell me if people leave this tent with one idea about being respectful, about respectful curiosity, about responsibility, what it is you'd like them to hold on to, just in a couple of sentences. Marcia, perhaps we'll start with you.
It's a nice way to end because, as we point out in our book, The Way of the Ancestors, and as is very evident in the multidisciplinary approach to documenting Indigenous knowledge in this book, Indigenous Knowledges, the Australian Perspectives, respect is fundamental in our culture. It is, along with balance, keeping the world balanced, one of the, the great values. And I think this is vastly misunderstood because of all the Aboriginal protests. So in Australia, non-Indigenous Australians see us as, almost as the enemy of the state because of, they see us as radical for wanting, basic human rights. Whereas, in fact, what we're asking for is respect. Respect for our existence, respect for our languages, respect for our cultures. And so one of my projects has been to ensure that our school curriculum incorporates understanding of our cultures and languages and histories. It's difficult, but we're slowly winning little battles on that front.
And if we could just end with you, Rashmi, just a few quick words about what you'd like people to take away from this session.
Yes, we need to. Sorry about that. Yes, we need to perhaps look back and think about what our ancestors did. They definitely had some science in what they did. They definitely had some logic in what they did, and which they brought down orally. We can just pass it down orally as perhaps stories to the younger generation, which I think carries more weight. They like to hear stories and put it in their minds.
Rashmi, thank you very much. Thanks to Marcia. It's been lovely speaking to you both.
Thank you, Georgina. Thank you, everyone.